My uncle drove up my gravel driveway on a Tuesday morning in his clean truck with his clean boots and his practiced expression of concern. He walked the property with me for about 40 minutes. He looked at the fields. He looked at the irrigation setup. He looked at the farmhouse that needed a new roof and the equipment barn where 2 of my tractors had been sitting idle since March. He looked at all of it with the careful attention of a man who was building a case while pretending to offer help. Then we sat at the kitchen table. He put a piece of paper in front of me. The number on the paper was $280,000. $280,000 for 160 acres of land in the Palouse region of eastern Washington that my grandfather had worked for 31 years, and that my father had worked for 22 years after him, and that I had been working for the past 4 years since my father passed. My uncle said the soil was depleted. He said I was in over my head. He said the debt load was unsustainable. He said $280,000 was generous given the condition of the property, and he was only offering it because we were family. He said family takes care of family. He slid the paper a half-inch closer to me. He said, "Sign it today and I can have the money in your account by Friday." I looked at the paper. I looked at him. I said, "I will think about it." He said, "There is a window on this, Marcus. I cannot hold the offer forever." I said, "I understand." He drove away. I stood in the kitchen and watched his truck disappear down the county road. And then I picked up my phone and I called the attorney who had been handling my side of a negotiation that had been running for 6 weeks. A negotiation my uncle had no idea existed, involving a technology company that wanted 160 acres of flat, high-elevation land in eastern Washington for a data center campus. The attorney said, "Good timing. They came back with final terms this morning." I said, "Tell me." She told me. I said, "When do they need my signature?" She said, "They want it today if possible." I said, "I will be at your office in 2 hours. I want to tell you everything. How this land came to me, what I found when I started working it, what my uncle actually wanted, and what happened the moment word got out about the $24 million deal. Like this video right now, subscribe and hit the bell, share this with someone who needs it, and drop a comment telling me if you have ever had family try to take something from you at your lowest point. Let us go all the way back. My name is Marcus Tillman, and I am 34 years old. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, which is the second largest city in the state and sits about 20 miles west of the Idaho border, in a region that the rest of the country tends to forget exists when they think about Washington, which they associate with Seattle and rain and mountains. Eastern Washington is different. It is high desert and wheat country and wide open sky, and the specific quiet of a landscape that does not have much interest in impressing anyone. My grandfather, Harold Tillman, homesteaded the farm in the Palouse region outside the small town of Colfax in 1961. He bought the land cheap because it was considered marginal at the time, too far from the main agricultural corridors, too exposed on the ridge. But Harold had been a soil man before he was a farmer. He had worked for the county extension office for 6 years after coming back from Korea, studying soil chemistry and the specific organic processes that determined whether a piece of land could produce over time or whether it would exhaust itself. He knew things about the land that the people selling it cheap did not know. He built the farm over 12 years of consistent, methodical improvement, cover crops in the off-season, careful rotation, specific amendment programs based on regular soil testing, drainage management that took 3 years to design and 2 more to implement. By the time my father was old enough to work the land alongside him, the farm was producing wheat and legumes at yields that consistently outperformed the regional average. Harold passed when I was 6. My father, James Tillman, took over the operation at 32. He was not quite the soils scientist his father had been, but he was a hard worker and a careful manager, and he kept the farm running profitably for 20 years before the markets and the weather and the debt he carried from a major equipment purchase in 2008 started making things complicated. He passed away from a heart attack in the fall 4 years ago. He was 59. He was on the tractor when it happened. The paramedics said it was fast and he probably did not suffer. I was in Denver when it happened. I had been in Denver for 6 years at that point, working in commercial real estate analysis for a firm that handled agricultural and industrial properties in the Mountain West region. The work was good, and the pay was solid, and I was building a career in a city I had chosen deliberately to put distance between myself and a childhood that had been complicated in ways I am going to tell you about. My father and I had a relationship that was functional and careful in the way of two people who love each other and find each other difficult to communicate with. He showed love through the work he did. I showed it through calling regularly and visiting twice a year. We did not talk deeply. We talked practically. We talked about the farm and the weather and the prices and what needed fixing. The last time I saw him was August of the year he passed. I helped him repair a section of fence on the north boundary, and we ate dinner at the kitchen table, and he showed me the soil test results from that spring, which were, he said, the best he had seen in 15 years. He was proud of the results in a quiet way. He touched the paper when he was explaining it. He had his father's hands. He was gone 8 weeks later. The farm came to me. I want to tell you about my uncle Raymond before I go further, because Raymond is essential to this story, and you need to understand him fully to understand what he did. Raymond Tillman is my father's younger brother by 6 years. He is 55 now. He grew up on the same farm, worked it alongside my grandfather, and then alongside my father for a period in his 20s before striking out on his own. He bought a smaller piece of land about 12 miles from the Tillman farm and has been running a smaller operation there ever since. Raymond has always wanted the Tillman land. Not always in the visible way of someone who announces their desire. In the specific way of someone who has been watching something they believe should be theirs and who waits for the conditions to be right. He had expected to inherit a share of the farm from Harold. He did not. Harold left everything to my father, who was the elder son and who had worked the land continuously while Raymond had left. Raymond's reaction to that outcome was not visible in the moment. He was gracious in the way of a man who had expected something and received nothing, and who had filed the disappointment very deeply and very carefully. When my father passed, Raymond was at the funeral and was warm and present in the way of a supportive uncle. He helped with the arrangements. He sat with relatives. He brought food to the house. He also, at the reception after the service, asked me gently whether I had thought about what I was going to do with the farm. I told him I was going to work it. He nodded. He said that was admirable. He did not say he was disappointed. He said it was admirable. I moved to Colfax 4 weeks after the funeral. I gave up the Denver apartment and the commercial real estate job and the life I had built at a distance from the thing I had been keeping at a distance, and I moved into the farmhouse, and I started learning what I had inherited. The first year was the hardest thing I have ever done. Coming back to the farm at 29, with 6 years of commercial real estate analysis behind me and no direct farming experience, was a specific kind of education that no classroom prepares you for. I knew land values. I knew how to read a survey. I knew how to analyze an income statement and a debt schedule. These things were useful in the sense that they gave me a clear picture of the financial situation, which was not good. My father had been carrying $112,000 in operating debt, secured against the farm. The equipment loan from 2008 had been refinanced twice. There were 3 years of deferred maintenance on the irrigation infrastructure that would require significant capital to address. The farm was producing, but it was producing at the margin, and when you are at the margin, any bad year is a crisis. The first year, I had a bad year. A late frost in April damaged a significant portion of the winter wheat crop. The commodity price for wheat dropped 14% from the previous year. The irrigation pump on the south field failed in June, and the repair cost was $11,000 that I covered with the last of the cash reserves I had brought from Denver. By October of my first year, I had used every dollar I had, and the farm's debt position had worsened. Raymond came by in November. He walked the property with me, He looked at the frost damage areas. He looked at the equipment situation. He shook his head at the roof on the farmhouse. He said, "Marcus, I have been thinking about making you an offer." I said, "I am not selling." He said, "Just hear me out. I could take on the debt and give you something to start fresh with. You have a career in Denver. You could go back to that." I said, "I am not selling Raymond." He said, "You are going to lose it anyway if things keep going this direction. Better to sell on your terms while there is still something to sell." I said, "Thank you for the concern. I need to get back to work." He left. I spent that evening at the kitchen table with my grandfather's farm journals, which I had found in a wooden box in the equipment barn during my first week on the property. The journals were 12 notebooks covering 1963 through 1987. Harold documented everything: soil tests, weather patterns, crop yields, amendment programs, drainage observations, equipment decisions. The journals were the most comprehensive record of how that land worked that I had ever seen. I read them cover to cover over 3 weeks. And I started to understand something my grandfather had understood, and my father had partially understood, and that had been lost in the scramble of the debt years. The land on the North Ridge, the 40 acres that sat highest on the property and that had been producing the lowest yields, was not low yield because the soil was bad. It was low yield because it had been under the wrong rotation for 20 years. Harold's journals showed that those 40 acres, when managed properly, produced the highest legume yields on the property. My father had shifted them to continuous wheat to maximize short-term revenue, and in doing so had disrupted the soil chemistry that made them exceptional. The North Ridge was the most valuable part of the farm. It just did not look like it from the surface. I redesigned the rotation in year 2. I also spent the winter of year 2 doing something that nobody around me understood the purpose of. I was reading about data centers. The technology infrastructure that companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon Web Services build to house their computing systems requires land with specific characteristics. Flat terrain for large building footprints, high elevation for natural cooling that reduces energy costs, access to power infrastructure, distance from fault lines, proximity to fiber networks. The Palouse region had been getting attention from technology companies for 3 years because of exactly these characteristics. I had read 3 industry articles about this in the previous 18 months. I had also noticed, from the county property records that I had been reviewing as part of my farm management research, that several large parcels in the region had been purchased by shell companies with addresses in California and Virginia in the previous 2 years. Someone was assembling land for a data center campus. The Tillman farm was on the ridge. The Tillman farm had exactly the characteristics that data center site selectors look for. I made a call, not to a tech company directly. I was not naive enough to think I could call Google and have a productive conversation. I called a commercial real estate broker in Spokane named Diane Hartley, who specialized in technology infrastructure transactions in the Pacific Northwest, and who had been referenced in one of the industry articles I had been reading. I said, "My name is Marcus Tillman. I have 160 acres on the Palouse Ridge outside Colfax. I have reason to believe there is a data center development interest in this region. I would like to understand if my property is in a relevant location." She said, "Can you send me the parcel information?" I sent it. She called me back in 48 hours. She said, "Marcus, I need you to sit down." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Your property is directly adjacent to 2 parcels that were acquired in the past 18 months by a land-holding entity associated with a major technology company. Your parcel completes the contiguous acreage they need for a full campus site." She paused. She said, "They have been trying to identify the ownership of your parcel for approximately 6 months. Your property was flagged in their site assessment, but they could not reach the owner." I said, "My father passed away. The ownership transfer took time." She said, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you open to an acquisition conversation?" I said, "Yes, but I need to understand the market before I have that conversation." She said, "That is exactly the right answer. Give me 2 weeks." I gave her 2 weeks. And then the conversation started. Subscribe right now if you want to hear what the technology company offered and what my uncle did when he found out the truth about this land. The negotiation took 6 weeks from first contact to signed agreement. 6 weeks during which I told absolutely nobody what was happening. Not my neighbors, not the people I had become friendly with in Colfax, not my cousin Sandra, who was Raymond's daughter and who had been one of the warmer presences in my life since I came back. I told Sandra almost everything, but not this. Because Sandra loved her father and because the specific thing that was happening was the kind of information that, if it reached Raymond, would produce a response I did not want to manage in the middle of a negotiation. Diane represented my interests in the initial conversations with the technology company's real estate team. She was precise and experienced and had done 4 transactions of this type in the previous 3 years. She walked me through the market comparables for data center land acquisition in the Pacific Northwest, which were substantially higher than agricultural land values because the buyers were not buying farmland. They were buying infrastructure-grade acreage. The first offer was $14 million. I will let you sit with that for a moment. 160 acres of land that Raymond had offered me $280,000 for. First offer, $14 million. Diane said, "This is an opening position. The comparables support significantly more given the strategic nature of the location." I said, "What is our counter?" She said, "I recommend $22 million with a request for a development timeline guarantee and surface rights reservation for agricultural continuation during any phase transition period." I said, "Counter." The technology company came back at 17. We countered at 21 with modified surface rights terms. They came back at 19.5 with an accelerated closing timeline. Deanne and I talked for an hour. She said, "The accelerated closing is worth something to them. I think we can use that to get to 24 flat with a shorter surface rights reservation period." I said, "Do it." The final offer came in at $24 million with a 60-day close and surface rights reservation through the current crop year. I accepted. The signing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Diane's office in Spokane. The Monday evening before the signing, Raymond drove up my driveway. I want you to understand the timing. He could not have known about the deal. The negotiation had been completely private. Diane had signed an NDA. The technology company's real estate team operated through intermediaries. There had been no public record of the conversation. Raymond came on Monday evening because he had made a business decision about his timeline, and his timeline said Monday was the right moment to close the deal he had been building toward for 4 years. He came in and sat at the kitchen table. He said, "Marcus, I want to have a real conversation." I said, "Okay." He said, "You have been here 4 years. You are still carrying the same debt your father was carrying. The North Ridge is underperforming. The equipment situation has not improved. The farmhouse roof is going to need work before winter." Every word was accurate about the surface reality of the farm. He said, "I have a number that I think is fair for the current state of the property. I have thought about this carefully, and I want to be honest with you about where I am." He put the paper on the table. $280,000. I looked at the paper. He said, "Sign it today and I can have the money in your account by Friday. You can go back to Denver. You can start fresh. You are young. This land has taken enough from this family." I thought about my grandfather's hands on those soiled journals. I thought about the 40-acre North Ridge that Raymond had just called underperforming, not knowing that the North Ridge was the exact parcel that the technology company's site assessment had flagged as the most strategically valuable part of the campus footprint. I thought about $24 million. I said, "I need to think about it." He said, "There is a window, Marcus." I said, "I understand. I need to think about it." He left. I stood in the kitchen for a minute. Then I called Diane and asked if there was any way to move the signing to first thing Tuesday morning. She said, "I will call and confirm." I signed the agreement at 8:15 Tuesday morning. The deal closing process took 60 days from the signed agreement. During those 60 days, I continued operating the farm exactly as I had been. I tended the crops. I managed the irrigation. I made decisions on the equipment situation that needed short-term attention. The surface rights reservation meant the farm continued producing through the crop year, which mattered to me even after the signing because the land was still mine to steward until the close. I also, in those 60 days, had a conversation with an attorney about the estate and debt situation. The farm debt of approximately $130,000 at the point of the sale would be paid from the proceeds at closing. The remaining net proceeds after taxes, debt payoff, and fees would be transferred to an investment account that I had set up with a wealth management advisor in Spokane. The net to me after everything was in the range of $18 million. I called my mother, who had left Colfax when I was 12 and lived in Portland, and who had maintained a careful distance from everything related to the Tillman farm for reasons that went back to her marriage to my father. She picked up on the third ring. I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am better than okay. I need to tell you what happened with the farm." I told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Marcus." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Your grandfather would want you to know he saw this in the land." I said, "I know, I read his journals." She said, "He told your father once that the North Ridge would be the most valuable part of the property when the world finally caught up to it." I had not known that. I held the phone for a moment. I said, "He was right." She said, "He usually was." Raymond found out about the deal from a county property filing that became public record 3 days before the close. In Washington state, real estate transactions above a certain value threshold generate public records filings that anyone can access through the county assessor's office. The filing showed the property, the buyer entity, and the transaction amount. $280,000 to $24 million. Raymond was at the county assessor's office for a completely different reason that afternoon. He was reviewing boundary records on a property adjacent to his own farm. The clerk, who had been working in that office for 11 years and who knew the Tillman name, mentioned the filing as casual conversation. Raymond called me from the parking lot of the county assessor's office. He said, "Marcus." His voice was different from any version of his voice I had heard before, flat in a specific way. I said, "Raymond." He said, "The assessor filing, $24 million. I said, "Yes." He said, "Who bought it?" I said, "A technology company, data center campus." He said nothing for a long moment. I said, "The land on the North Ridge, the 40 acres you called underperforming. That was the parcel they specifically needed to complete the campus footprint." He said, "I offered you $280. I said, "You did." He said, $280,000. I said, "Yes." He said, "You knew." I said, "I found out 6 weeks before you came to the table with your offer. The negotiation was already running." He said, "You let me make the offer knowing what you knew." I said, "You let me sit at that table for 4 years while you waited for me to fail so you could buy the land cheap. I let you make the offer." The line was very quiet. He said, "Marcus." I said, "Raymond, I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it clearly. What you have wanted since Harold passed that farm to my father is the land. You have wanted it for 30 years. You offered $280,000 for land worth $24 million because you knew something about this region and you believed I did not know it. You were waiting for me to be desperate enough to take the number." He said nothing. I said, "I read Harold's journals, all of them. He documented the North Ridge soil chemistry in detail. He knew that land was exceptional. He knew it would produce in ways that the surface numbers did not show. He knew you knew it too. That is why he left the farm to Dad and not to you." The silence went very long. I said, "I will see you at family events. I wish you well with your farm. We are done with this particular conversation." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse. The same table where Raymond had put the paper with $280,000 on it. The same table where my grandfather had probably sat with his soiled journals in the evenings. I was very still for a while. Then I called Deanne to confirm the closing timeline. She said, "We are on track 3 days." I said, "Good." She said, "How are you?" I said, "Ready." The close happened on a Wednesday morning. I signed the final documents at 9 in the morning in Diane's office in Spokane. The wire transfer confirmed at 11:47. The farm was transferred. I drove back to Colfax. I stopped at the property on the way through. I parked at the edge of the north field and looked at the land for a while. The late season crops were still there, protected by the surface rights reservation through the current year. The land looked the same as it always looked, flat and wide and quiet with the specific eastern Washington sky above it. I thought about Harold standing on this ridge in 1961, deciding to buy land that other people thought was marginal. I thought about my father running the soil tests that spring and touching the paper when he described the results. I thought about 4 years of mornings in that farmhouse and the specific silence of a place that most people would have left. I drove into Colfax. I went to the diner on Main Street, where I had been eating breakfast 2 or 3 times a week for 4 years. The woman who ran it, a woman named Pat, knew my usual order. I sat at the counter. She poured my coffee without asking. I said, "Pat, the farm sold." She said, "I heard." I said, "The whole county heard by now." She said, "Small town, how do you feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Like I finished something." She said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I have been thinking about that." The honest answer was that I had been thinking about that since the signing. The $18 million in net proceeds gave me more choices than I had ever had simultaneously. I could go back to Denver. I could go anywhere. But the decision I actually made surprised me a little. I bought a smaller property. 22 acres, 8 miles from the Tillman farm, on the south slope of the Palouse Ridge. A property that a retiring farmer was selling, and that had soil characteristics I recognized from Harold's journals as exactly the profile he had described as ideal for specialty crop production. Not to farm at scale, to farm correctly. The specific way that Harold had farmed, with careful attention to the soil chemistry and the rotation and the long-term productivity rather than the short-term yield. I had the resources now to do it without debt pressure. I had the knowledge from 4 years of working the land and 12 notebooks of my grandfather's careful documentation. I was going to farm the right way. Raymond called me the week after the close. Not immediately, a week after, which told me he had taken time to decide what he wanted to say. He said, "Marcus, I want to say something." I said, "Okay." He said, "What I offered you was predatory. I knew the land had value you were not aware of, and I offered a number that exploited your position. That was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you why." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I grew up on that farm. Your grandfather built it and I worked it and I watched your father inherit it, and I never stopped feeling like part of it was mine. That feeling made me do something that was wrong." He said, "A feeling being real does not make what you do with it right." I said, "No, it does not." He said, "I am sorry." I sat with the apology. The thing about a real apology, one that acknowledges the specific wrong without trying to explain it away, is that it is harder to stay angry at than a partial one. I said, "I accept that." He said, "Are you staying in the area?" I said, "Yes, I bought a smaller place." He said, "Farming." I said, "Specialty crops the right way." He said, "Harold would like that." I said, I know. My cousin Sandra called me that evening. She said, my dad told me what he said to you. I said, I know. She said, he cried after he hung up. I said, I believe that. She said, are you two going to be okay? I said, we are going to be honest with each other. That is better than okay. She said, that is very Tillman of you. I laughed. She laughed. She said, your grandfather used to say that honesty was the only fertilizer that worked on family. I said, that is the most Harold thing I have ever heard. She said, he said it at Thanksgiving every year. Your dad used to roll his eyes. I said, my dad was terrible at Thanksgiving speeches. She said, he really was. We talked for a long time. About Harold and my father and the farm, and what it meant to inherit something, and what it meant to earn something and the difference between the two. At some point, she said, what are you going to do with the money? I said, farm correctly, invest carefully, and help my mother retire comfortably. She said, that is a good list. I said, it is enough of a list for now. I am sitting at the kitchen table in my new farmhouse this morning. It is smaller than the Tillman farmhouse. The kitchen is better. The roof is sound. The south-facing window looks at the 22 acres I am going to spend the next several years learning at the same depth that Harold learned his 160. The 12 journals are on the shelf in the study. I read them again in October, the second full read-through, the second time I understood things I had missed the first time. Harold wrote on the last page of the last journal in October of 1987, the land does not care how you feel about it. It responds to what you actually do. The soil is the record of every decision made on it. Work carefully, and it will be honest with you. I think about Raymond sometimes. Not with anger, with the specific understanding that comes from seeing a person clearly. Raymond wanted something his whole life that he believed should have been his, and that wanting shaped every decision he made about the farm for 30 years. The wanting was real. What he did with it was wrong. Both things are true, and both things need to be held together to understand him accurately. He comes to family dinners now. We are careful with each other in the way of two people who have had a real conversation about a real wrong, and who are deciding what the relationship is after that. It is not easy, but it is honest. I drove past the Tillman farm last month. The technology company has broken ground. The site prep is done, and the foundation work has started. By next year, there will be a campus there where there was a wheat field. I stood at the boundary for a minute. I thought about Harold buying that land in 1961 because he understood it better than anyone else did. I thought about my father touching those soil test results in August. I thought about Raymond's truck coming up the driveway on a Tuesday morning with his $280,000 piece of paper and his practiced expression of concern. And I thought about the specific feeling of signing a $24 million agreement on a Tuesday morning, knowing that the land my grandfather had chosen carefully for specific reasons, he documented in 12 notebooks, had finally been understood by the world at the value he always knew it held. He saw it. He was just early. The lesson I carry from all of this is simple. Know what you have before you let someone tell you what it is worth. Do the work to understand. Read the records. Talk to the right people. Resist the pressure of someone who comes to your table with a practiced expression of concern and a number that serves them rather than you. The world is full of people who will tell you something is worth less than it is because they want to own it. Your job is to know better. Harold knew better. I know better now. Thank you for staying through this whole story. It means everything that you are here. Drop a comment below. Tell me if you have ever had someone try to take something from you by convincing you it was worth less than it was. I want to read every single one. Subscribe and hit the bell. We are here every single week with a story exactly like this one. Share this with someone who is sitting on something valuable right now and does not fully know it yet. They need to hear this story. See you in the next one.